This is an Obsidian Nights special episode.
Old powers waken, shadows stir. An age of wonder and terror will soon be upon us. An age for gods and heroes.
The glass candles are burning, and you're listening to the Obsidian Nights podcast. Many people throughout the fandom have loyalty to specific characters, and so many people have loyalty to Stannis Baratheon. Here at the Obsidian Nights podcast, we neither like or dislike him. We just do not understand why he inspires so much loyalty and why he is so well liked in the fandom. So today we are bringing you this Obsidian Nights special. Why Stannis Baratheon? Why do so many people like him? And we've brought on a special guest to plead the case for Stannis Baratheon.
Stannis the Menace. All right, so why don't you guys go ahead and introduce yourselves?
Hello, it's me, Gray Area.
And I am Jeff, better known as BryndenBfish, scientist, philosopher, astronaut, astrophysicist, Olympic athlete, and I also have a podcast at the NotACast Podcast, where you can find me also on Twitter as @BryndenBfish, on Reddit as BryndenBfish, and my website where you can read all the Song of Ice and Fire material that you ever want to read is called Wars and Politics of Ice and Fire.wordpress.com.
And it's absolutely insane that we got this guy on. He's like so busy. It's absolutely incredible.
Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate it. You actually caught me at a good time. Usually I don't have a lot of time to do guest spots on things. Typically I'm doing my own stuff for the NotACast podcast, as well as I actually have a career as an astrophysicist, a scientist, an Olympic athlete, and an astronaut. I mean, those things kind of take up the bulk of my time these days.
I'm an astronaut too, by the way.
Yeah, what was your mission?
Whatever one you were on, I went with you, remember?
They were on the same one. I said, no, you didn't. She's been exposed.
Exposed.
All right. So the idea to do this came from, I was having a chat with Gray Area, and we were like, well, actually, first off, I decided that I wanted to do this because I've been keeping a terrible secret from all of my subscribers on YouTube and all of my followers. I don't love Stannis.
All right, I'm hanging up.
So many of you, so many times have I read in the comments, you should do a video on how great Stannis is and how awesome Stannis is. And I've never been able to do it because I don't really think Stannis is that awesome. So I was talking to Gray Area one day and she said, you know what, we should get BryndenBfish on because that guy loves Stannis. Maybe he can convince us, because we're both just kind of meh on Stannis. Maybe he can convince the two of us that Stannis is awesome and not just kind of middling, bland, vanilla. So, you want to step in?
Guys, such an uphill battle, but I mean, I feel like I'm totally qualified to do this because, one, I'm a brilliant scientist, and secondly, I love Stannis. So, I mean, I have both those things going for me at the same time.
You're the shit. You are the shit, Jeff. You're the shit.
I appreciate that. I feel like more people need to know this, and they don't. Not enough people acknowledge that I am the shit, according to Gray. I'm going to put that in my Twitter bio going forward.
You know, the thing about Stannis is that, like I said, I don't hate him. I don't even dislike him. I just simply don't understand why, amongst some members of the fandom, he inspires such love and passion, like he's just the greatest guy ever.
Yeah.
So, BryndenBfish. What? Give me just a couple of reasons why Stannis is awesome, why he's great.
I mean, the first thing you have to acknowledge is that he's the king, right? He's the king of all of Westeros, the Andals, the Rhoynar, the First Men. He is the king. Correct me if I'm wrong, and you're not, and you can't correct me because I'm right, because Stannis is the king. So that doesn't necessarily make him a person worthy of being followed and enjoyed and being kind of worshipped in the fandom. And now, I should kind of caveat this a little bit. So my love for the character Stannis is not one of simple worship, right? I feel that there's a contingent in the Stannis fandom which kind of views this guy as perfect, as unable to do anything wrong. And I'm here to set those people straight as well. So, there are some things about Stannis that are not so admirable, right? You have a pretty strong strain of misogyny in the character of Stannis. His relationship with his wife, Selyse, is pretty bad. He doesn't barely communicate with her. He only has sex with her twice a year, according to Davos and according to Cersei. And he kind of treats her as someone that annoys him. And this is not to say that Selyse is necessarily the most wonderful, engaging, loving, kind, warm person in the world. It is to say, though, that Stannis' relationship with his wife is a bit off. And we also have elements, too, where Stannis in A Dance with Dragons treats Asha Greyjoy as a lesser person, and Asha, correctly in my opinion, judges that based on her gender. So these are reasons why maybe you shouldn't like Stannis. You also have elements, too, where there's this great quote from Jon Snow where Jon thinks about Stannis of Dance with Dragons that Stannis Baratheon with a grievance was like a mastiff with a bone. He gnawed it down to splinters. So there is an element in Stannis' characterization which has this sense that he feels very slighted by the world around him, by the characters who are all kind of circling around him, whether it's Robert, whether it's especially Renly, it's the Lannisters. These types of people annoy him, and they annoy him because they're taking things that they feel are his by rights, and he feels like he has to kind of gain his justice for his own cause. Now, the reasons to like Stannis. So, a couple reasons. One, and probably the most important reason, is that he is the only king in all of Westeros who has recognized the threat of the others, or the White Walkers in the show. It's the White Walkers in the books too. And he is the only one who is acting to defeat them. He's the only one who comes north at the summons of the Night's Watch. There's that great quote by Samuel Tarly where he's thinking about Stannis coming north and fighting against Mance Rayder and the Wildlings. And he says 5 letters went out, and 5 kings received those letters, but only 1 king answered the call, and that person was Stannis Baratheon. So Stannis Baratheon is the one who recognizes the threat of the White Walkers. And he says to Sam and Melisandre and Maester Aemon, when he's describing the others, he says, demons made of snow and ice and cold, the ancient enemy, the only enemy that matters. And I think this is a really important quote, because what this quote is demonstrating from Stannis is he's recognizing the threat of the others, and he's recognizing that the War of the 5 Kings and all the subsequent wars and battles that flow from it are immaterial to the war against the next long night, the Long Night. So he's the only king that recognizes this. Letters went to Balon Greyjoy, Joffrey, Renly, Robb Stark even. And they were never answered. Now, in the case of Robb Stark, the reason why it wasn't answered is because the Red Wedding happened and Robb was killed before he could answer the summons of the Night's Watch. So I definitely think that it's definitely a not a mark against Robb Stark that he didn't answer the call. He was dead by that time. The other thing, too, is that Stannis is an admirable character because he is one of the few characters that consistently listens to good advice and acts on it. There's that great line where Stannis is talking about what Davos Seaworth, and Davos Seaworth presenting him the letter from Maester Aemon at Dragonstone, and Stannis says to Jon Snow after the Battle of the Wall, Lord Seaworth is a man of humble birth, but he reminded me of my duty when all I could think of was my rights. I had the cart before the horse, Davos said. I was trying to win the throne to save the kingdom when I should have been trying to save the kingdom to win the throne. So what I'm seeing in Stannis there is his recognition that his duty to save the kingdom of Westeros comes before his throne. And that's what makes him king. Now, there is an inherited right in kingship in Stannis, and that is important for him, very, very important for him. But more important than that supersedes that, is this idea that he has to defend Westeros first. He has to demonstrate his value, his worth as a man who can actually hold the kingdom against the threat of the wildlings, potentially against the threat of the others as well. Although, of course, we haven't seen that in the books, and the show short-circuited that route for him. Now, the other aspect that I really, really like about Stannis is one that he's a pretty competent military commander, perhaps the best military commander in all of Westeros. In fact, he is the best military commander in Westeros. So when you're thinking about who you want to be fighting against the others, against the threat of a second long night, do you want someone like Balon, like Renly, like Joffrey, Maybe Robb Stark could be fine, but Stannis Baratheon is the most experienced military commander in all of Westeros. He's the only person that recognizes the threat of the others, and he realizes that his duty is to safeguard the realm against the threat of the others and against the threat of wildling invasion. So those are kind of the three major aspects that I like about Stannis. I mean, on a personal level, before I go into the personal side, one final thing I really like about Stannis is that he has instituted something of a bit of a meritocracy, and this doesn't get talked about enough about him, in that in terms of the politics of Westeros, he is very much about putting the best person in a position of authority and leadership. And the best example of that is someone like Davos Seaworth, who he has elevated to knighthood, to lordship, and he eventually makes his Hand of the King. So he makes Davos Seaworth a man who was born in Flea Bottom, whose inherited right is non-existent. He was raised up as a lord by Stannis Baratheon after he returns from the Blackwater. He was raised up as a knight before that. He's not a man of nobility. His wealth, any wealth that he had, was gained by piracy and by smuggling, or mostly by smuggling. He wasn't actually a pirate. He's the guy who brought the materials from the pirates to other places. But that is something that really kind of strikes me about him, is that he sees the worth in individual people and he raises them to positions of authority and leadership over top of this kind of idea of inherited worth and inherited leadership. And we do see that as well in places where he thinks that after Robert's rebellion, Jaime Lannister should have been sent to the Wall, where he thinks about things like, I had urged Robert Baratheon to kind of scour King's Landing clean after the rebellion. Varys should have been put to death. All Pycelle should have been sent away. All of these characters who are just pieces of shit in terms of leadership, they're the ones that Stannis like, these guys don't deserve to be in positions of leadership, but because they have an inherited right, because they're backed by powerful political people, they have that right of kingship. Whereas Stannis thinks that, or not the right of kingship, the right to political leadership. Whereas Stannis thinks that the right to lead is based on your merit, primarily. Now, there are exceptions to that. We can talk about those exceptions if you like to, but I think that's an important distinction that makes Stannis all the more admirable. More kind of a little bit personally for me, I really enjoy his character. I think he has a very sharp wit that is kind of understated, and to some points where Jon Snow is kind of wondering if Stannis is like kind of fucking with him or not at certain points. And you have other places too where Stannis has a very sharp tongue. So yeah, I think that's another. These are all aspects of Stannis that I really, really enjoy on a personal level. His wit, I enjoy his leadership style, his military experience, and his history of being the best military commander. I mean, come on, guys. I mean, think about it. Stannis Baratheon, at the age of 18 years old, held out against 100,000 Reachmen at Storm's End. And then just a few years later, he defeated Victarion Greyjoy in sea battle, in his first ever naval battle. He defeated Victarion Greyjoy in battle. Defeated Mance Rayder's 100,000 north of the Wall. Took Deepwood Mont. And he's going to take Winterfell in the Winds of Winter. Boom. All right, I'm done.
All right. So yeah, that a lot of really, really excellent points. Stannis is certainly an excellent military commander. I've never denied it. Yeah, I think there's no arguing with that. He definitely does get major points for being the only king to go to the Wall. But I would argue that he's really the only king that had any reason to believe that there was any real problem. Because he has Melisandre right there with her shadow babies whispering in his ear and telling him that it's a real problem. So does he necessarily get points over everyone else? Because they have no reason to necessarily suspect that it's even real.
So yes, he does get points because Joffrey, in the form of Tywin Lannister, receives the same letter from Maester Aemon in A Storm of Swords, and Tywin, his response to the letter is basically to say, okay, well, why don't we just let Mance Rayder just run rampant through the North? I mean, they're like, fuck the North. They rebelled against us. That's not part of our kingdom. They can take care of Robb Stark. Like, that is Tywin Lannister's response, is not to be like, my duty is to the realm, or in the form of acting on behalf of Tommen and Joffrey. Their duty, and me acting as Hand of the King, is on behalf of the realm. Tywin's response is a mercurial, what am I going to get out of this? And the fact that Mance Rayder is going to be in the North, great. That sounds great, right? To have like thousands of peasants die, to have widespread war across the North, that's all fantastic and wonderful. Stannis never asks for anything in return for going to the North. He just goes because he realizes that that's his duty. So I think that's a distinction you want to make between because every king received the letter, those that were living at least, and those kings that received the letter, from what we know, Balon Greyjoy did nothing because Balon Greyjoy is the worst, and Tywin Lannister received the letter on behalf of Joffrey and Tommen, and his response was, well, let Mance Rayder destroy the North. Who cares? Now, I think the point you're making though is a two-faceted point, in that you're talking about the threat from the others, as well as the threat from Mance Rayder. So the threat from the others, okay, fair enough. Tywin Lannister doesn't know about the threat of the others, but wouldn't you say it's an advantage to have Melisandre at Stannis' side, who's able to interpret things on a more metaphysical level, on a more spiritual level, if you want to call it that? And doesn't that give Stannis an advantage that you want to have him in a position of leadership and a position of wanting to go to the North, because he recognizes that the threat is emanating from some place that is beyond simple steel and swords from regular folk, that there's a external supernatural force at work here? Is that seems like the person that you want to have at the helm, so to speak, of the realm?
Yeah, I wasn't saying that it wasn't. I was just saying that, like, I don't know if he necessarily. I think it was more Melisandre's doing that he went north than it was him going of his own volition and saying, I'm going to save everything. I think it's Melisandre saying that if you do this, you'll be king, that's driving him a little bit more than what you're admitting to.
So, at least from Stannis' own statement, from that idea about the cart before the horse, his idea was that he had it wrong from the beginning, that he had the cart before the horse, that he thought that he should wear the crown in order to safeguard the realm, whereas he recognizes, and he doesn't say this comes from Melisandre, he says this comes from Davos, and that's an important distinction to make here, is that Davos gives him good advice and says, hey, Your Grace, you have it wrong. You've been spending your entire time as King of Westeros attempting to seize the Iron Throne and seize the instruments of power in order to safeguard the realm. Well, Your Grace, you got it wrong, man. Like, the actual concept of kingship and of royal rule is not that the crown makes you worthy of safeguarding the realm. It's safeguarding the realm that makes you worthy of the crown. And that Stannis listens to that advice and he follows through on that is really what sets Stannis leaps and bounds above any of his competition. So Melisandre plays a part, for sure, in kind of guiding Stannis and recognizing that the threat is a more supernatural threat. That Mance Rayder, sure, a pretty existential threat in terms of what he could do in the North and in Westeros and in weakening the realm ahead of the others. But beyond Mance Rayder and the Wildlings comes the others, comes the White Walkers, and that is where a character like Melisandre has a lot of value for a character like Stannis. This kind of atheistic, non-spiritual, pragmatic, realistic character, because he's seen the power within Melisandre. And I think possibly some folks think that Melisandre is a charlatan. I feel like if you've watched through season 7 of Game of Thrones and read through A Dance with Dragons in the books, at this point, Melisandre is not simply a charlatan. There is real power. She sees real things. She often misinterprets those things that she sees in the fires, but they are not necessarily the wrong things that she's seeing. And she correctly interpreted that the others are the ones who are actually coming. They are the real threat. And that is really the final culmination of this story, right? Is the conflict between the others and the White Walkers versus humanity. And Stannis being there in the leadership position in the North is one that is a really, really good thing. Now, of course, he has to wade through a pile of Bolton and Frey corpses to get there, but we could talk about that at some point around here.
Yeah. Okay, so that's a very good point. That's a satisfying answer. And I also liked what you said about Stannis' ruling structure, how he sees value in certain people and he's willing to put people in positions that reflect their abilities.
Right.
So that's also a very good point about Stannis. Gray, it sounded like you wanted to say something earlier. Do you have anything to throw in?
Yes. So, one thing, it's just a small thing, is that you said that Stannis never asked for anything for saving the wall, but he did. He asked for men, he asked for castles, he asked for a lot.
Right, but consider what he's asking for in terms of what the Night's Watch has on hand. So, he's asking for Castle Greyguard, the castle... What's the castle that's west of the wall where Bran goes through and Mira and Joe? The Night Fort. There you go. So he asked for these different places. And the reason why he asked for them is because they're unmanned. These structures, the defensive structures along the wall, are unmanned. There are only 3 structures that the Night's Watch is currently occupying. Castle Black, East Watch by the Sea, and the Shadow Tower. out in the western part of the wall. So he does ask for men. He asks for castles. His original idea is not to ask for the men of the Night's Watch. His original idea was to incorporate the wildlings that were brought south as captives from the Battle of the Wall into his army. But, and this goes back to talking a little bit about Stannis in terms of listening to good advice. Jon Snow, in A Dance with Dragons, this wasn't featured in the show, but in A Dance with Dragons, Jon Snow talks with Stannis and advises him not to use the wildlings in order to go south to fight against the Boltons and liberate Winterfell from the Boltons and the Freys and all those motherfuckers. His idea at that point was to take the wildlings down. Jon says, no, but I can provide you a way to get another source of men and soldiers to incorporate into your army that'll be much more than the wildlings that we have on hand here. And what does Stannis do? What is Stannis' response in Jon's 4th chapter in Dance of Dragons? He says, okay, great, show me. Where can I find these men? And he decides to leave all the wildlings back at the wall. And he has the Night Fort. Of course, Selyse plans to take up residence there at the end of A Dance with Dragons, although she has not headed over to the Night Fort yet because it is still technically in disrepair. Even as the wildlings and one of the Night's Watch parties are repairing it. But at the same time, consider again that these castles are unmanned and that Stannis' presence, his soldiers, Selyse, the Queen's men, any retinue that she brings there would boost the defense of the wall itself for an unmanned castle. And I think that's important context to consider. We're talking about Stannis and his asking for things, and also recognizing too that even as he's asking for things, he is taking the advice of characters like Jon Snow, who are natives to the north, who is able to provide him with a satisfying answer where to pick up more men. So after Jon 4, Stannis marches southwest to the clans of the Flints, the Norries, and the Wolves. And from there, he picks up 3,000 men. He takes Deepwood Motte, and then he picks up the Glovers, the Mormonts, more of the survivors from the original Battle of Winterfell back from A Clash of Kings, where Ramsay destroyed the Northern Army under Sir Roderick Cassel, and the survivors fled into the woods. Stannis listens to advice. He doesn't take the wildlings with him. He has not yet manned the other castles on the wall, though he plans to man the Night Fort and some of the other castles along the wall. So I think it actually boosts the defenses of the wall without taking anything away from the Night's Watch.
Yeah, I get that part, but I remember Jon wasn't happy about it. He was like, these northern lords are not going to be happy with giving northern castles to southern lords.
Yes, absolutely. Jon recognizes that the wildlings particularly are not going to want to follow Stannis because he just defeated them on the battlefield. So you want to put those men into your army. This is not quite like the South where, and also I understand too where Stannis is coming from. So after Renly was absolutely justifiably killed by a drone strike by the Shadow Baby.
Oh yeah, that's the topic.
A drone strike.
Drone strike, right. It was basically a Predator Shadow drone strike, yeah. So after that, what happened with Stannis is with Renly's army that was in and around Storm's End is that a lot of them came over to Stannis' side, and that is a common feature of Southern warfare where the armies of former enemies are then incorporated into the armies of those who are fighting who are the victor of the battle. You take an example like Aegon the Conqueror, who incorporated the armies of the Riverlanders into his army when he invaded Westeros, and he fought against the Reach and the Westerlands at the Battle of Fire back during Aegon's conquest. This happens all the time there. Stannis being not really quite up on the up on what is northern and wildling culture is not necessarily a mark against him. It would be a mark against him, in my opinion, if he had just continued with this policy, but instead he listens to the advice of a native Northman, that person being Jon Snow, and then adapts those policies that Jon suggests to him as his way of doing business. And what happens? He gets the Flints, the Norries, the Walls. He gets all the Mountain Clansmen, all of them, 3,000 men. He picks up House Mormont and House Glover out in the western part of the north. And he's marching against Winterfell as well. Like, he has united the portions of the north that are not incorporated into the Bolton Frey army, at least in terms of A Dance with Dragons. Again, we're not talking about the show yet. And then is marching against Winterfell itself. So, yes, these are things that you'd be like, yeah, Stannis, you're dumb. But at the same time, you're not dumb because you're getting better. And I think getting better is all that you can really ask for in terms of a king who has never really been into the north, right? There's no evidence that Stannis was ever north of the Neck at any point prior to him coming to Eastwatch by the Sea in a storm of swords and then fighting against Mance Rayder and the wildlings at the Battle of the Wall outside of Castle Black. So that's my response to that.
Sweet. Okay.
Point.
So
What
okay,
point?
I wanted to bring up this point since we kind of touched on this. So obviously the show takes a very different turn for Stannis.
Yes.
And there's a lot of different arguments for where it could go in the books. I tend to think about that vision that I think Daenerys sees in the House of the Undying, which everyone points to being Stannis, which is the blue-eyed king holding up a flaming sword, casting no shadow.
Mm-hmm.
I have a bunch of different interpretations of what that could possibly mean, but I wanted to ask you, what is your interpretation of that image, that vision?
I think it's a dual image there. I mean, I think blue-eyed king who casts no shadow. I mean, that's Stannis. I think that's representative of Stannis because Stannis casts no shadow. He has a flaming sword, and he's blue-eyed. That's one thing that's also brought up is that House Baratheon has dark hair and blue eyes. That is a defining physical trait of all the Baratheons. It becomes a very big part of Ned Stark's hunt to find out why Jon Arryn was killed, which is a whole other matter. But at the same time, I also think that there is a potential secondary interpretation, which has that being the others themselves, right? Blue eyes is associated with the Whites, Author, and Jafer Flowers from a Game of Thrones. It's associated with the others themselves, as we saw in the Game of Thrones prologue, as well as the first couple scenes from season 1, episode 1 of Game of Thrones, on into season 7 of Game of Thrones, where the Night King is very much blue-eyed as well as kind of blue-complected as well. So yes, I think there are definitely two elements of interpretation there, but I definitely think that Stannis is part of that. And I believe part of the prophecy in the House of the Undying, and I have to refresh myself because I've not read that chapter in about a year, 2 years or so. But part of that is a lie that Daenerys must slay. Is that one of the mother of dragons, slayer of lies? Like
they call her the Slayer of Lies. Yeah. Well, specifically, the part of that imagery that I like to point to and kind of focus in on is the casting no shadow part, right? Because then you have other examples where George R. Martin points to Tyrion, and I think it's twice in the whole series where he says Tyrion is casting a very large shadow.
Yes.
So that obviously, thematically and symbolically, that means something, right?
Yes.
And I have an interpretation of what that means for Tyrion. And then I also have an interpretation of what that means for Stannis. Mm-hmm. Casting no shadow, that could mean that his line dies off, that nothing, it's just Stannis, and then
I like that. I think it's accurate. I think Stannis and Shireen will be the last of their line, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, besides Gendry and Edric
mm-hmm.
Storm from the books. I mean, but they're the bastard line of House Baratheon. I think that's going to be the line that's going to live beyond the ones who are beyond Stannis, Robert, Renly, and Shireen.
But my other way of looking at it that I had been tossing around was that it could represent influence in some way. Because McCorrell says to Tyrion, I see you, a small man with a big shadow, in the midst of all these dragons, casting a very large shadow. And then Jon sees Tyrion and he says, small man casts a large shadow. So Tyrion is a small man, but his influence is great.
Yes.
So if you took that same reasoning to that image that Daenerys sees, what does it mean that Stannis casts no shadow? Could that mean that everything that he's doing now ultimately won't matter?
It depends on how you mean by won't matter. So will Stannis live until the end of A Song of Ice and Fire? No. Will Shireen? Definitely not. Will Selyse? No, definitely not. Again, I think like his line dies. But in terms of having no meaning, I mean, look at the things that are going on in Stannis' arc as we see it right now. George R. R. Martin has crafted Stannis to be a character that, despite all odds, has somehow survived to this point in the story when rationality would say that he's finished, he's done. So I think, yeah, it's possible that is a very interesting statement about Tyrion having a long-term influence and that his existence will expand out. I also think, too, Tyrion, and I was doing this recently on the NotACast Patreon, where I was talking with Emmett, my co-host, Emmett, otherwise known as Poor Quentin, as well as as well as Grant, aka Heathen King on Twitter, about Aegon. And one of the things that I brought up there that it suddenly hit me was that Jon Snow is one of the few characters who has ever interacted as far north as Castle Black, and has had an influence on Jon Snow, even to the point in A Dance of Dragons where Jon is still remembering things that Tyrion says, even if he can't necessarily remember who said them, which is kind of sad. But at the same time, Tyrion has had an impact on Castle Black, Winterfell, King's Landing, on Essos, on Volantis, on Meereen. Eventually he'll intersect with Dany's arc as well. And who knows what George and the showrunners from HBO's award-winning Game of Thrones series have in mind for Tyrion as well. What further impacts he's going to have all the way down the line. I think it's really vital for Tyrion as a character in the story that he is consistently intersecting with different portions of the narrative, locationally, thematically, and character-wise. And Stannis does too, although I would say it's probably a little bit to a lesser extent because his pathway is much more constrained initially by his campaign to take King's Landing through Clash of Kings, and then on up north. He's isolated in Dragonstone in a Storm of Swords. He finally gets up north, and he's finally interacting with the Night's Watchmen, and now he's on the march to Winterfell at the end of A Dance with Dragons. So it's a little bit... It's interesting. It's an interesting point you bring up, though, I think, about casting long shadows and casting no shadow. I think is an interesting distinction worth thinking about from my perspective.
Well, okay, so everyone knows that I love Dune, right?
No.
So Frank Herbert...
Dune? You like Dune?
Frank Herbert, the author of Dune, he likes to look at things in Dune from, like, the long view of history, right? So these books take place over thousands of years. And so I think about, okay, let's say the Long Night happens in modern A Song of Ice and Fire times, and like 500 years go by or something. The people that are still in Westeros, still around, looking back on these times, assuming that there are people, how are they going to look at all of these characters? And then I think among these fantastical characters like Daenerys, who freed the East and has dragons, and Jon Snow, who's probably going to get brought back from the dead, how is Stannis going to be viewed in the long view of history? As someone that murdered his own brother with a shadow demon.
Justified.
But no one knows that.
I mean, but in the long, that's the thing though. In the long view of history, I could almost see Daenerys being worshipped. Like, she already has religious connotations, the way they call her Misa and like lift her up, and they almost pray to Daenerys already. So like when Daenerys is around and Jon Snow around, I wonder about where Stannis will be in history. And I think that could relate to the shadow.
So, for long-term Stannis, like, I'm not a Stannis fan. I don't dislike him or whatever.
You will be. After this.
But I do think that if it goes down, like how everyone thinks it's going to go down, where Stannis is actually the person that wins the battle for Winterfell, I do think he will be remembered, at least in the North.
The North remembers.
The North remembers. And at the Wall, too. Because he did, like, save their ass at the Wall.
Yeah, I mean, you would hope, right? I mean, as a fan of Stannis Baratheon, as the token Stannis Baratheon fan on this episode of the podcast, you would hope so, but I don't think so. I mean, so what is the major... in the narrative itself? So Stannis Baratheon is constantly feeling aggrieved by different things. And if you list them... it's that Robert Baratheon never thanked him for holding Storm's End for a whole year and resorting to eating rats and shoe leather in order to survive at the Battle of Storm's End. He's aggrieved because Stannis didn't name him the Lord of Storm's End. He named Renly the Lord of Storm's End when by rights it was Stannis' position to hold. He's aggrieved by all of these things, and I think what we're seeing primarily is that in Robert's rebellion, and if you read The World of Ice and Fire, I think this gives a kind of interesting perspective. Robert is seen as this glorious war leader who defeated Rhaegar Targaryen and the rest of the Targaryens at the Battle of the Trident. He won 3 battles in a single day outside of Summerhall. He won at Gulltown up in the Vale. He defeated Jon Connington at the Battle of the Bells. He took King's Landing itself. Whereas Stannis Baratheon gets a single sentence in The World of Ice and Fire, which is, oh yeah, and then Stannis Baratheon was down in the south holding Storm's End against Tyrell Siege. That's, I think, what we're seeing in Stannis, is that so much of what he does is will be seen and has been seen historically in Westeros as being inconsequential. Whereas in reality, it's extraordinarily consequential that Stannis went north to save the wall from the wildlings. It's extraordinarily consequential that Stannis is the one that's being positioned going on into the Winds of Winter, being the one who's going to liberate Winterfell from the Boltons and the Freys. I don't think he's going to get credit for that, though. I think what's going to happen is that 10 minutes after Stannis takes Winterfell, Robb Stark's will, anointing his bastard in quotation marks, brother, also in quotation marks, Jon Snow as king of the North. And the Northmen, I think, are primarily likely going to abandon Stannis at that point and flock to Jon Snow's banner. Or, potentially as well, you have Sansa Stark coming north with the Vale of Arryn and all the Knights of the Vale, under the tutelage of Peter Baelish, Littlefinger, as you know in this book, in the books in the show. So, I think, honestly, all of the glory that Stannis should receive in the history books, all of the mentions and recognition that he's going to receive, should receive, is not going to be given to him. I think that ultimately the Battle of Winterfell, as great as and as much as I'm looking forward to in the Winds of Winter, is going to be a sideshow at best compared to the threat that the others pose in the War for the New Dawn. Those types of heroics that characters like Jon, Sansa, and others who are fighting against the next long night are going to way overshadow any of these kind of sideshow battles of Winterfell, Battle for the Wall, these types of things. And I think that's an important note that we're going to be seeing in Stannis' arc going forward. He's not going to get a lot of recognition for what he's done, and he's going to be essentially seen as a bit of a bit player, so to speak, in terms of the history. And I think that's the narrative that is being integrated into the world of Ice and Fire. And I think that's also what we're going to be seeing going forward through the Winds of Winter on into A Dream of Spring and whatever afterwards. 1,000 years after events from the books, Stannis, if he gets any mention at all, will be like, oh, and then Stannis was there too, kind of thing.
I was going to say that I think that the ultimate tragedy of the character Stannis could potentially be that he does all these amazing things and essentially saves the entire realm, but then he's utterly forgotten and people just they just remember Jon and Dany and all the others, but not Stannis.
Mm-hmm.
I did want to ask, why do you say Stannis should have been named Lord of Storm's End if the heir apparent is supposed to get Dragonstone?
So it's two minds, right? Basically, George R. R. Martin has talked about how Robert just gave Storm's End to Renly as kind of part of his careless generosity, the same way that he gave Dragonstone to Stannis. And the reason why Stannis believes he should have been named the Lord of Storm's End is because at that point, Joffrey has already been born. So this is before we start getting to questions of Joffrey's parentage. So Joffrey becomes the heir apparent to Robert. Joffrey likely should have been named the Lord of Dragonstone in order to kind of train him as kind of his royal tutelage. Stannis then should have been renamed to the Lord of Storm's End, rather. So that's kind of the distinction there. When Robert gave Storm's End to Renly, though, it was kind of demonstrating that Robert didn't think much of Stannis. And Cersei, as you know, whether she's a good source or not, has said to Tyrion in A Clash of Kings that Storm's End was given Storm's End was not given to Stannis as a direct insult to Stannis. That's what Robert intended it as, an insult to Stannis. So, again, consider your sources. Obviously, Cersei's not necessarily the best source, but at the same time, there is a historical precedent for a Baratheon, the second Baratheon son. Well, there is actually no historical precedent. It probably goes back to the heir side of it, where the Baratheons were the Lords Paramount of the Stormlands, that they would then, when Robert had an heir, his heir should have been called to Dragonstone, and then Stannis should have moved from Dragonstone to Storm's End. So that's kind of the rationale behind it. But again, George R. R. Martin has talked about it as being a part of Robert Baratheon's careless generosity that he didn't name Stannis as Lord of Storm's End.
Cool. I know. I just was wondering because I'm like, well, like, isn't that an honor that he gave him Dragonstone? Like,
well, consider this: is that Stannis was still the Lord of Dragonstone at the start of A Clash of Kings, right? Joffrey is 13 years old at the start of A Game of Thrones. So Joffrey has been in existence for 13 years before Stannis is put on stage, essentially. So 13 years that Stannis has been stuck on Dragonstone, always thinking that he probably would have been moved to Storm's End, but he wasn't moved to Storm's End. Instead, he stayed as Lord of Dragonstone while his younger brother is holding the traditional Baratheon seat of power at Storm's End, that person being Renly, aka the terrorist.
We've been dancing around this issue this entire podcast episode. How can you defend Stannis Baratheon for his act of kinslaying using dark magic?
Well, I mean, easily. It's a justifiable kill. So let me take a comparative example. All right? And I'll make this more of a conversation piece. In A Storm of Swords, Daenerys Targaryen uses dragons to kill the good masters of Astapor, correct?
Yes, she does.
Was she justified in that?
They aren't related to her.
The good masters of Astapor?
We can talk
The
about the
slavers?
good masters of Astapor are not related to her. Okay. We can talk that piece in a second. Let's talk about the magical piece, the dark magic piece of it first.
Well, are dragons necessarily dark magic?
Well, dark magic is kind of an ambiguous term.
Let's
just use the term magic in terms, just generally. So dragons are magical beasts, right? They breathe fire and flame. They're fire-made flesh, according to A Song of Ice and Fire. Was Daenerys incorrect to use dragons, or morally compromised to use dragons to kill the good masters in Astapor?
No.
Specifically because they were magical?
Correct.
No.
No.
No, I would agree. I would absolutely agree. So is Stannis wrong to use shadow babies, to use magic to kill a terrorist at Storm's End?
Yes.
Come on, follow the logic.
Why do you say yes, Gray?
Well, because that morning or late night, they're trying to tell Renly to like just storm Stannis's camp, and you have the numbers, and he's like, no, I said the hour is dawn, and dawn it will be, or something like that. I don't know the exact quote, but Renly wasn't willing to use treachery to kill Stannis. He wasn't.
But okay, so that is a one form of ethics. It's basically deontology, that you should do everything according to the one way you would do one thing is the way you should do everything, right? Sort of idea of ethics. But there's also the kind of the consequentialist method, which says that the consequences should outweigh any morality. So, what are the consequences of Stannis using dark magic, so to speak, to kill Renly?
He gets his army.
He gets his army, but what else happens? What also happens is that there's not some huge battle where thousands of men die in the field outside of Storm's
Oh my God, you're sounding like Tywin.
I
Is
knew you
it
were gonna
more?
say that.
Is it more honorable to kill a dozen men at dinner than 1,000 on the battlefield?
But Tywin is full of shit, because it's not a dozen men at dinner. It's thousands of Northmen that die at the Red Wedding. It's not just Robb Stark and the party inside of the Twins itself. It is actually the party inside of the castle inside that's feasting with Walder Frey and Edmure Tully and all of them. It's also the 5,000 or so Northmen that are outside of the castle itself that are all murdered on behalf
Okay, but then Tywin
wedding.
totally leads a significant portion of those men to their horrible deaths. I mean, you could this is a fantasy series, right? Mm-hmm. And Melisandre's magic is very mysterious. We don't know exactly what she's doing and where exactly her powers come from. We know that she was in the East for a while, that she studied shadow binding and whatnot. You brought up Daenerys, but it's not what Daenerys did wasn't wrong specifically because she was using magic.
Correct. I agree.
I think that she was justified in what she was doing, even though it was out of a hunger for power. That is true. She was doing what she was doing mostly out of a hunger for power, not necessarily to free the slaves. Even though I think she cares. I do think Daenerys is a character that cares. I think that she wanted to free the slaves, but I do think that she also has somewhat of a hunger for power, even though, like, at her core, I think she probably just wants to go back to the Red Door. But I think that I think there's multiple things working in tangent with her. Yeah. Sure.
No, it's not. It's in Dorne's. Like, no, it's in Bravos.
Hell yeah.
But when it comes to Stannis, all right, so Melisandre summons like this shadow creature, right? Mm-hmm. Davos is afraid of it because obviously he's never seen anything like this. He's not afraid of it because it's necessarily like an evil dark force. Like you said, when we apply labels to magic like dark or evil, that's us like bringing a kind of prejudice to it, right?
We're bringing our own values into the story.
Yeah,
makes total sense. Exactly.
But I do have a problem with treachery and kinslaying. I have a problem with Stannis kind of killing Renly on the low. I have a problem with him going in and like just sneaking. I feel like that's really low, and I feel like if someone like Jaime was doing that, people would have a huge problem with it. If people knew that Stannis was a kinslayer and that was like well known, I feel like people in Westeros would be like, it's wrong. It's wrong to be a kinslayer. I just feel like that's immoral.
I agree.
It's immoral because it was treachery, and it's immoral because it was his own brother.
I agree, but Courtney Penrose, Courtney Penrose's death bothered me more than Renly. But I wanted to say something. I had a good point ready, and I'm just like blank. It was about what Quinn was saying. Fuck it, move on. I forgot. It left me.
Well, let me maybe my counterexample will help kind of trigger your memory. So, Quinn, I guess the question I would have is, so if Stannis had put together a crack team of 5 dudes to go in and to kind of stab Renly in the night, would that be worse or better?
It would be just as bad, in my opinion.
Yeah, I at least that's consistent. I mean, I don't see, in my opinion, like, Stannis has won most of his battles because he has used the element of surprise, tactical surprise on the battlefield in such a way that he has defeated overwhelming forces against him. Whether that's using the straits between Fair Isle and Westeros, mainland Westeros as a whole, to constrain the Iron Fleet, so he's able to defeat them with the Royal Fleet, even though he's outnumbered and up against a more experienced sailor in the form of Victarion Greyjoy. Whether that's using a 2 feints before driving his main force through the wildling lines there. He's using deception, and you can call it treachery if you want to extend the term that way. In a lot of his battles, so to speak, he's using the element of surprise in a way that he can gain the best advantage of the battlefield.
That is not the same.
But it is the same if you look at it in terms of the consequences, right? The consequences are that Renly Baratheon dies and 16,000 Stormlander soldiers are spared from being defeated by Stannis on the battlefield the next day.
We don't know the full consequences, right? Because
we can't. I mean, we're getting into an alternate universe where Renly survives and there's battle met at the next day. But at the same time, thousands of people are going to die one way or the other, right? Stannis has 5,000 men. Renly has 16,000 at Storm's End. A significant percentage or amount of them are going to die in battle the next day. In my opinion, the more just action in that point is to kill the one person who is fomenting rebellion and treason. That person is Renly Baratheon, of course. And by then ending the battle before it even starts, sparing the lives of thousands of people on the battlefield, and gaining an army in the process. It's a win-win situation. I don't know what you guys are talking about.
Well, okay, so perhaps I'm going to backtrack a little bit. Perhaps it might have been better if he had just sent guys to sneak in and kill Renly, because then he's not playing with these other forces. Because George R. R. Martin makes it very clear that there's a price to magic, and there seems to be kind of this karmic influence, and I kind of see that in Stannis. I think that what he did by kinslaying his own brother with this strange magic out of the East might have had ripple effects that might continue to affect him down the line. I think that might have been the result of what happened at Blackwater. I feel like that kind of rippled from that as well. But I feel like there's kind of this what's the word, esoteric, metaphysical thing going on that's affecting Stannis because of this specific event, and I feel like it radiates from this point.
Yeah, certainly, and they talk about, Melisandre talks about that Stannis' fires have gone low, so she can't make another shadow baby with Stannis. That's a point that's brought up, that there is a cost to magic. But the cost of the magic was borne by Stannis himself in terms of his own personality. When Davos reunites with Stannis in A Storm of Swords, he notices that he looks 10, 15 years older than when he last saw him. So he's had the impact of magic has had a bit of an effect on Stannis, a bit of a negative effect on him, but he's borne the cost himself. Now, I feel like maybe we should circle back to whether Stannis is actually involved in Renly's shadow.
I was thinking like, does, like, right now when you just mentioned that chapter of him reuniting with Davos, like, does he even think that he killed Renly? Because he's kind of like, Melisandre was with me. She saw it in the fire. There was nothing that could be done. So it's kind of like he doesn't even really know that he killed him.
That's a good point.
Yeah, my co-host on the NotACast podcast, poor Quentin, aka Emmett, lovely husband of mine, he's of the opinion that Stannis knew and was responsible for Renly's death. Me, on the other hand, I more feel like that this was Melisandre's doing primarily, in that she used Stannis to kind of bring about a best case scenario for him without really informing him of what she was doing, sort of thing. Like, my lord, put me in charge of taking out this usurper, sort of thing. Or maybe it wasn't even explicit like that. Maybe it was the fact of the sexual union between Stannis and Melisandre that produced a shadow baby, but Melisandre didn't tell Stannis the consequences or the cost or what would actually come from this union. Just like that scene from A Clash of Kings, where Stannis is like thinking through and he just is not really sure. So essentially, in Davos' second chapter in A Clash of Kings, Davos is questioning Stannis about how Renly dies. And of course, remember that Davos was not present initially at the Battle of Storm's End, or at the initial confrontation between Renly and Stannis. So Davos says, and for Renly, when Stannis is talking about, I will bring justice to the rest of the realm. And for Renly is what Davos said. The words were out before Davos could stop to consider them. And here's the line. For a long time, the king did not speak. Then very softly he said, I dream of it sometimes, of Renly's dying, a green tent, candles, a woman screaming, and blood. Stannis looked down at his hands. I was still abed when he died. Your Devon will tell you. He tried to wake me. Dawn was nigh, and my lords were waiting, fretting. I should have been a horse, armored. I knew Renly would attack at break of dawn. Devon says I thrashed and cried out, but what does it matter? It was a dream. Important line, it was a dream. I was in my tent when Renly died, and when I woke, my hands were clean. So you could take that a number of different ways. I mean, one interpretation is that Stannis is just basically trying to justify himself and abscond from responsibility for Renly's death. The way I take it to mean is that Stannis has no fucking idea what's going on with what actually happened, and that he was up at his tent. He was in some sort of spiritual, magical trance as brought on by the formation of the Shadow Baby. And the Shadow Baby then struck and killed Renly, and Stannis was essentially an unwitting participant in Renly's completely justifiable drone strike killing by Melisandre / Stannis.
Well, the way I interpret it is that I don't buy that Stannis had no idea. I definitely get the sense from hearing that passage that he knows what he did, but he's kind of trying to deny it. He's kind of trying to be like, maybe I didn't do it. He's trying to kind of give away his responsibility and say, I was in bed, I don't know what happened. We do have to account for what level Melisandre might have been manipulating him this entire time into doing this. But I think ultimately Stannis had to know deep down what was happening and what was going on, what he was getting himself into. I don't think Melisandre just did it willy-nilly. I think on some level, Stannis always knew what needed to happen and what she needed to do.
Yeah, I agree with... So, what I think is that she convinced him that Renly was going to die anyway. That she had seen it in her fires. Yep. Try to talk to him if you can, but he's going to die anyway. And then Stannis just has some confusion about the whole situation. But Courtney Penrose, on the other hand, I think he knew exactly what was going to happen.
Maybe not. What's not especially clear is Stannis' reaction to Courtney Penrose's death. And what, again, take into consideration the amount of information that Melisandre is giving to Stannis in order to convince him, or to kind of get him out of the picture so he doesn't bear quote-unquote responsibility for it. Now, I think it should be taken into consideration, and this is a point maybe in your guys' favor, is that Stannis' rationale of being in Storm's End is he's going to meet Renly Baratheon in battle one way or the other, right? So he has to, it's a kind of a kill or be killed situation. Renly's formation of Stannis is basically like, oh, well, if you find my brother on the battlefield, just make sure that nothing bad happens to his dead body, but bring me his sword, sort of thing, is what Renly tells his men at their council in right after he meets up with Stannis in the parlay in Catelyn's third chapter in Clash of Kings. But at the same time, these guys are about to meet in battle. The idea is kind of kill or be killed. Either Stannis or Renly have to emerge victorious, and in order to emerge victorious, you have to be still taking air. And Stannis has to realize that at some level that he has to kill Renly, either on the battlefield or by some other way. I mean, there's no getting around that necessarily. To me, it kind of feels like maybe splitting straws, whether he was actually responsible for casting the Shadow Baby, whether he was aware of what Melisandre was doing. Again, I don't think that he was aware. I think Melisandre tends to constrain the amount of information that she conveys in order to best meet the circumstances of the people who are asking questions and wondering about her magic. I mean, that comes up in A Dance with Dragons, right, where Melisandre is being questioned by Jon Snow about this vision, the fire she sees. Was it tall towers falling into the sea, right? And it's one of the major visions from A Dance with Dragons.
Mm-hmm.
And Jon says,
Yeah.
Eastwatch by the sea? And Melisandre thinks, Eastwatch. And she thinks about it, and she's like, well, there were kind of towers there, but I don't know if it was necessarily Eastwatch. But then she's, yes, definitely Eastwatch by the sea is where that's happened, where that happens, sort of thing. So look at the character of Melisandre and look at how she conveys information, whether she's being truthful and how much that she's holding back from what she's revealing, so to speak. Now, we do see that scene from the Clash of Kings prologue where she says that she sees Renly dead in the flames as something that she brings up explicitly. But at the same time, if Stannis' sole intention was just to murder the shit out of Renly, which of course, as we all know now, it's not murder, it's a completely justifiable killing of a terrorist via journalism. It's at the same time, why does Stannis parlay with Renly in the first place? Why does he come and speak with his brother? Why does he try and offer peace terms that are appropriate, that would name Renly, who is taken a treasonous act by crowning himself, by being crowned king of Westeros ahead of his brother, which is treason, and has gained a huge army, has brought that army to bear on Stannis at Storm's End? Why does Stannis then go into a negotiation, into diplomacy with Renly at that point? And why does he offer him real things like the lordship of Storm's End? He would name Renly his heir until a son could be born to him. These are things that kind of do conflict about this idea that Stannis always intended or was always planning from the get-go to kill Renly the terrorist. So I don't know. That's a lot of different things kind of going into that.
Well, I don't know if he was always planning it, but I think he knew when it was. When Melisandre did what she did, and she conjured up his shadow, I think he, on some level, knew what was going on when that happened, and that was something that he allowed to happen.
Okay, so, but he probably wasn't there when the Shadow Baby was born, right?
No, he wasn't there when the Shadow Baby was born, but it is, if we read context clues, I guess it is his shadow. It's like a representation of his being in essence that's being cast out into the night and killing people.
Born of a sexual union between Melisandre and Stannis. I mean, the question that you have to ask is that when Stannis was having sex with Melisandre, was the intention that what our union will produce will be some sort of magical force that'll kill Renly? I don't get that sense necessarily.
I don't know.
I also... I don't know. I feel like we're... I mean, that stuff is kind of extra textual at that point too. Is that we're kind of how much was Stannis aware of? And the only answer we get is that single passage from the Clash of Kings, which, I mean, I think we have 3 people here and 1 right interpretation, mostly mine, and your 2 wrong interpretations. The wrong one, which is that Stannis was cognizant at some level that he was sending some sort of magical being to, or using Melisandre to magically, justly kill a terrorist in the form of Renly Baratheon.
Well, the problem is we just don't have enough information about the inner workings of Stannis Baratheon's mind, because there is no POV. So all we can do is speculate about a lot of this stuff, what he specifically thought about specific things.
Can we talk about Courtney Penrose now?
Sure.
So definitely Stannis knows that Melisandre is going to be going to do some kind of magic shit in Storm's End in that castle, because he instructs Davos to take Melisandre there, and he doesn't want them to see her, so he knows that she's about to go and do something.
Okay.
Good point.
I mean, that's treachery.
That seems like he was implicit, unless Melisandre was just like, take me here, I'm going to do something. I'm not going to tell you what I'm doing.
Sounds exactly like Melisandre, doesn't it?
I mean,
that
but
Melisandre would keep it totally ambiguous.
But then after
what would
that, he had to know what she did.
Yeah, but what would he be thinking that she's going to do? Go treat with Courtney Penrose after he just told Stannis, like, he's going to wipe his banner on his ass and shit?
I mean, so Courtney Penrose, another absolutely, completely legitimate, justifiable killing.
No.
Because, well, what is Courtney Penrose holding Storm's End? Like, why? What is his rationale for holding Storm's End against Stannis?
He'll leave Storm's End, and he'll leave Storm's End with Edric. And then he also was willing to do single combat.
But there's no advantage for Stannis doing single combat. So you got to dial back. So I think a lot of times this gets a little bit muddled a little bit, in that Stannis wants Edric Storm not because he wants to burn him. That comes later in Storm of Swords, and we'll talk about that, I'm sure. But at that point in A Clash of Kings, Stannis wants Edric Storm because he is looking for a physical demonstration that the kids who are saying that they're Baratheons, namely Joffrey, Tommen, and Myrcella, are not actually Baratheons. So Edric Storm is the only acknowledged bastard of Robert Baratheon. Of course, as we know, Robert has 19 bastards, and we've met, I think, 7 of them in the story. Edric Storm is one of them, Gendry, Maya Stone, Barra's baby, and I believe maybe there's 2 more. I could be totally wrong about that. So at least 4 off the top of my head. From Cersei's prophecy, it's 19 or something like that. I don't remember off the top of my head. But the reason why Stannis wants Edric Storm is not to burn him. It is to use Edric Storm as a demonstration that the kids of Cersei Lannister are not the actual physical, biological children of King Robert. And that would illegitimize their Joffrey, Tommen, and Myrcella's claim to the Iron Throne, and would put Stannis in line for the Iron Throne. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I know that's why he wants him, but like, why should Courtney Penrose give Edric to Stannis though?
Well, he's got no reason why not to give him to him at that point. I mean, Sir Courtney Penrose says, so the line from A Clash of Kings, so when Stannis is treating with Sir Courtney Penrose, the terms that Stannis says is, I will pardon you for treason, as I pardon all these other lords. Those are the other Stormlander and Reach lords that have joined his service after Renly is justly killed for being a terrorist. The men of your garrison will be free to enter my service or return unmolested to their homes. That's interesting. You may keep your weapons and as much property as a man can carry. I will require horses and pack animals. And then Courtney says, and what of Edric Storm? My brother's bastard must be surrendered to me. Then my answer is still no, my lord. So.
Yeah, because Courtney Penrose has basically raised Edric. So basically Stannis is saying, give me your son.
Well,
even though it's not actually his son, but he raised him.
So, I mean, you have to look at what Stannis' perspective here is. His perspective here is not to burn Edric Storm. He's not trying to take Edric Storm prisoner so he can burn him to R'hllor as some sort of sacrifice. Again, it comes in a Storm of Swords. His perspective is that he needs Edric Storm to be taken with him so that he can demonstrate that his alleged nephews and niece are not actually his nephews and niece, that they're bastards born of incest between Cersei and Jaime. And the way that it kind of works, and the way that it's determined that Ned Stark and Jon Arryn before him determined that Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen are bastards born of incest, is through kind of this very simplified genetics, in that any children born between the union of a Lannister and a Baratheon have always come out black of hair, right? Black of hair, black of hair, black of hair. Right. Edric is the very image of Robert Baratheon. He's described by that multiple times. So having Edric as that physical representation of the fact that Cersei's kids are bastards born of incest is an incredibly potent form of power politics, in that in a society like Westeros, where you probably have 90% illiteracy rates in the country. I mean, we know that the Night's Watch, only like 1 in 15 can read, and fewer than that can command. I think is something that G.R.R. Mormont talks about in A Game of Thrones. Having something physical to look at is much more powerful than simply having a claim to the Iron Throne, some sort of esoteric, constitutional, I'm the brother of the king, and that makes me the king because these kids are born of incest. We're like, well, how can you prove that? It's like, well, take a look here. I've got my bastard nephew here, who is the acknowledged bastard of Robert Baratheon and Delena Florent, and that bastard proves that any children born from Baratheon stock comes out black of hair.
Yeah.
It's been seen historically throughout. So, go ahead.
Yeah, I agree that is why Stannis wants him. And I agree that it is a good reason why Stannis wants him. But I also understand why Courtney Penrose doesn't want to give him to Stannis, because he feels like he raised him and he doesn't want to give him to Stannis because people don't even really like Stannis because he doesn't laugh. He's a hard, prideful man. He's the iron that doesn't bend. So I could see why someone wouldn't want to give their child, quote unquote, to Stannis because of the reputation that Stannis has. And this is before he started burning children.
He hasn't burned any children yet.
And also he literally has no idea what Stannis is going to do.
Yeah. No, I know that, but like
I'm just saying, like he doesn't have any idea what he's going to do, so he's like, why should I give him to you? Especially when there's already rumors about Stannis Baratheon dealing with this Shadow Witch from the East.
Yeah.
He's got this whole new religion, this whole strange new religion that has a burning heart. And I don't know. I feel like he should be suspicious
and
of
I'm
what
sure
Stannis is going to do with this child.
And I'm sure, like, you know, the whole Renly thing, Renly being dead, also plays a big part in it.
I mean...
And there's rumors circulating around about what happened.
Yeah.
With Renly.
But those rumors likely haven't reached Storm's End. So consider... So if you gotta go back to how George R. R. Martin structured the story. So Stannis takes his small army, disembarks around Storm's End and besieges it. Renly marches from Bitterbridge up in the Reach down to Storm's End to confront Stannis. Stannis' army is still besieging Storm's End. The garrison within Storm's End itself doesn't have access to the same information that the army outside of Storm's End has access to. The Reach army, Stannis' army, anything like that. So he's operating in an information vacuum. Courtney Penrose is. There's no reason why Courtney Penrose has no reason to suspect or think that Stannis is going to do whatever to this kid. And, you know, as we see in A Storm of Swords, this kind of gets a little bit kind of presented, so to speak, but we do see in A Storm of Swords that this kid has free range of Dragonstone. He's playing with Shireen. These two cousins are friends of each other. Stannis' daughter is hanging out with Edric Storm. There's no reason to suspect that's Stannis.
I mean, how old is Edric?
11 or 12, I want to say.
10?
How many times has Stannis visited him at Storm's End, or how many times has Edric went to Dragonstone to see Stannis? In all of those years. And then all of a sudden you show up demanding him, and Renly's gone, and you want Storm's End.
And the people at Storm's End, they should know about Melisandre already too, right? Because they were talking about Melisandre in book 1. On the small council, someone says Stannis has brought like a Shadowbinder from the east. I believe that's in book 1, right?
Says that. Tywin says that Varys has said...
Tywin says it.
That Stannis has brought a Shadowbinder in the east. So we're talking about the upper echelons of political Westerosi culture that have a higher level of knowledge than your average Castellan at Storm's End. And that's not to be like...
Okay.
Fuck Cody Penrose because he's not smart or anything like that. But it is saying that... I mean, he's an idiot who had it coming, if we're being honest. It is saying, though, that Courtney Penrose probably doesn't have the same access to information that Tywin Lannister does. Varys is not sending missives to Storm's End saying, "Oh, Stannis has brought a Shadowbinder from a Shire." Most likely. I mean, that is again extra textual, but it seems to me that the level of information that Courtney Penrose would have about what Stannis is doing was very restricted to essentially speaking with Stannis outside of the gates of Storm's End in that parlay that they have in Davos' second chapter in The Clash of Kings.
I gotta go back and look at that shit because I need to examine and see how much Courtney Penrose might have known. Because I feel like maybe, like, for the fact that Stannis has had Melisandre for
he knows about
that information has maybe gotten stirring a little bit. People know about this. This some juicy gossip.
He knows, and he knows that Melisandre follows the Lord of Light because he says May the others bugger your Lord of Light and wipe his arse with that rag you bear.
See, there we go. And then the motherfucker, he's changed his Stannis. His Stannis. He has changed his sigil to like some weird ass burning shit. Like, I'll be a little bit freaked out. Like, what's going on with you, my friend? This is not. I don't remember you being like this before.
But but when
happening?
Courtney Penrose challenged him, he said, "Is it the justice of your cause you doubt, my lord, or the strength of your arm? Are you afraid I'll piss on your burning sword and put it out?" Like, Courtney Penrose had so many. He had so many badass lines.
He knew. Because like they've been doing some extra shit since the beginning of this book, like burning statues. That had to get out. Like, people on Dragonstone, they were talking about that shit. Like, people know that they burnt those statues.
I think he told him too. He said something about you change your god like the way you change your boots or something.
And people know what R'hllor is. People know it's a fire religion.
Yeah.
So I'm saying, like, people know what's up. Like, people have heard of that religion. They know about Volantis and the Red Priest. Like, that's out there. So they know what they do. And they know they set motherfuckers on fire. And you're suddenly asking for a child after you just somehow killed your brother.
Courtney raised Edric. Like, he's been the castellan at Storm's End forever.
I'm not giving you this child after you just killed your own brother. Are you playing me? And then obviously he assassinated his own brother with some crazy shit. Because like there's no battle, so it's like the more I think about it, I'm just like. Nah.
And then they tell him, I think they tell him that Brienne did it. They tell him that Brienne killed Renly, and he's like, "Fuck out of my face! No, she didn't."
He's like, "Yo,
no, she didn't. Lies."
She wanted that D so bad that. No, she would have done anything for Renly. Anything.
Yeah, I really liked him as a character for the couple seconds that he lasted.
At the end of this Obsidian Night special, the Courtney Penrose juice that I dropped made Jeff's mic explode, literally, and we weren't able to close out properly, but I'll tell you what he said anyway. He said, "Yes, Gray, yes, Quinn, you are 100% right in everything you said." No, I'm just kidding. His mic really did break, so we didn't get his closing thoughts. But you can find BryndenBfish and his podcast husband, Poor Quentin, at their podcast, NotACast, where they read through chapter by chapter of A Song of Ice and Fire. They are cracking into A Clash of Kings right now, so you can get all of that Stannis the Manus analysis from them. The links will be in the description box. We would like to thank Bfish for coming on our podcast. We really appreciate it. Also, Eddard 1 is on the way, so get ready. Thanks for watching, thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next one.